Good morning. So, when we started planning this series on creative, joyful faith, I did not expect to be present on Zoom and having to watch myself preach on video. But Mari won a fellowship contest. She gets to be one of 10 kids who get to go to the International Science Fiction Convention. She is currently meeting authors and illustrators and folk from the industry. And since I'm the one who found out about it and encouraged her to apply, I get to be the one to take her. It was a pivot this week, but not an entirely bad one, because it really got us thinking about what it means to be creative beyond being a painter or a writer or somebody we think of as traditionally creative. We've said pivot a lot, not just this week, but since like March of 2020. If I never again have to say, we pivoted, I will be fine with that. I'm not gonna lie though, pivoting, or whatever you want to call it, has been a strength of mine since long before the pandemic, and it's something that I even find joy or delight in. To change directions and still meet the same goals takes creativity, maybe a little stubbornness, and a willingness to risk, even when it means we might fail. In today's story, one of our creation stories from Genesis, we see how creativity and persistence, a willingness to risk, have been hallmarks of God's action in the world since the very beginning of everything. Older translations of Genesis 1 often begin with, "In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth." For many of us, this is familiar. It's like the first notes of an overture that promises the joy of experiencing a favorite musical. But there's also kind of what's arguably an error in understanding this. The Hebrew lacks that definite article, the. Many scholars will say it's implied. Everybody just knew it was the. Many scholars will say if it was intended to be there, it would be there. So we've got options. In the beginning, God created. Or in the beginning, when God was creating. Or in the beginning, God was creating. And these give us some broad creative differences just from these little shifts in what words we use. Is there just one beginning, like in the beginning implies? Is God done with creating, like when God was creating implies? Is what we're living just one story of infinite creations, like in the beginning God was creating implies? I love these questions. They are huge. They push us to think critically about our faith, about the very groundwork of what we believe about God and creation and what's happening even now. But we're going somewhere else with this today. Because it doesn't matter if creation was a one-time thing, or a couple tries and then done thing, or even an ongoing infinite thing. Creation happens. And creation takes creativity, persistence, and a willingness to risk, even if it means we might fail. We can see from the start how the authors of this text are working with a very different understanding of things like science, and geology and cosmic geography than our understandings of those things today. Things were either up or down. They were in or out. They were here or there. Existence or not, there was no Schrodinger's cat. But we don't need this to be scientifically true to get something relevant for our spirituality out of it. In this text, we get to witness God create, right? Something from nothing. Separating dark from light, water from land, water from water. Putting the lights in their places, giving them specific work to do. Right? Making plants, making animals, and then being like, you know what we should make? People. It's all new. And whether creation was one and done, or some good tries before really getting it, or is still happening even now, this early beginning story has it all happening in ways it hadn't happened before. It's a risk we see God taking. It's a risk to make something out of nothing. It's a risk to imitate God by living creatively, by letting our faith be an act of creation that trusts that God is going to keep on creating new life in us. It's a risk to imitate God by living creatively. I feel this every time I pick up a pencil or a paintbrush or go to start creating a new pattern. I feel this risk every time I sit down to write an email or a sermon or start planning a new program. There is, I think, this infinite promise of the great unknown, and it's so exciting. And okay, this is a big blank canvas. Where do I even begin? It's easy to be intimidated, especially if you struggled with, say, a lifetime of perfectionism, right? It's easy to freeze, to panic, to be tempted by the idea that, like, somebody else already did this pretty well. Maybe I can just, like, do that, but put my own spin on it. But our life of faith can't be somebody else's, but a little bit my own. The creative, joyful, risky faith God calls us to is a faith where we follow God as God intends. Together, certainly, but not the same way as it looks like for anybody else. God has called us to a life of abundance. Creativity and joy are part of that. God made it all, and step by step, every step of the way, God called it good. And let's just be clear here, God called it good. God didn't call it the best. God did not be like, oh, that is the best possible C, we're done. God called it good. God didn't make it and roll God's eyes and be like, okay, that could be better, but I'm getting kind of tired and like, I don't know if I'm up for this again. God called it good. And when we're willing to take that risk of a creative faith that calls us toward relationship and abundance, we can find that emerging for ourselves as well. That it doesn't have to be perfect. It doesn't have to be the best or even one of the best. But to follow God openly, creatively, seeing what might be there and even playing around with it. We find ourselves getting to a point where we too can look at our actions, our days, our relationships in our lives, and call it good. A good life. A good striving to make the world better for all creation. It's good. And that's good. I often find myself ending sermons with something like, it's not easy, but we're in it together with each other and God. And I want to shift that today and end with this. It's good. It's creative. It's joyful. It's all good, and we are in that goodness together with God and with each other. Thanks be to God. Amen.